Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In part 2 of his essay, The Ethics of Belief, William Clifford is going to devote a good bit of discussion to what we can call, as he does, tradition. Now, not everybody makes appeals to it under that rubric, but we could think about other things that are filling in a similar role. Sometimes when people appeal to common sense in certain contexts, it has a similar sort of function. And after having said, well, we can't always trust the testimony of individual people, even if we think that they're really swell, really awesome people, morally good or even perfect, we need to know whether they have indeed carried out the sort of inquiry that would result in knowledge and good judgment. What about something that we can call tradition, as he calls it, the tradition of the human race, the authority more venerable and august than any individual witness. So venerable, older, right? It's intergenerational, perhaps goes all the way back to the beginning of human beings, and august, it's greater, it's better in some respects. So why would we appeal to this? He says, we have an atmosphere of beliefs and conceptions that's been formed by the labors and struggles of our forefathers, which enables us to breathe amid the various and complex circumstances of our lives. There's a lot of things that have been passed on down to us. We don't need to inquire into them and figure them out. If we did, we'd probably never get anywhere, right? And it's even deeper than that. He says, it's around and about us, and within us, we cannot think except in the forms and processes of thought which it supplies. Which isn't to say that every single mode of thinking we do is coming from tradition or a tradition. It is, however, saying you can never fully get away from it. You're always going to be dependent on it to some degree. So the question then is it possible to doubt and test it? And if possible, is it right? Now, we know that it's possible to doubt and test individual beliefs, but the whole fabric of beliefs that comprise a tradition, can you bring all of them into doubt and test them all at the same time? And he goes on to say, we'll actually find reason to answer it's not only possible and right, but, and here's where it's the ethics of belief, it's our bounden duty. And here he will make a distinction between two fundamentally different ways of construing what is tradition. So a lot of people, according to Clifford, have the mistaken idea that what tradition really means is a collection of statements. It's, you could say, cut and dried statements, meaning statements that are already cookie-cuttered. We've already got them fixed to be accepted without further inquiry. And he says, hey, if that's the way you understand tradition and you're accepting it, you are actually doing something bad for yourself. You're also doing something bad for everybody who's going to follow after you because you're not actually checking whether any of it's true. And he is going to say, this is a theme running through his entire treatment of tradition, the main purpose of the tradition itself is to supply us with the means of asking questions, of testing and inquiring into things. Once that is lost, we've got some problems. Now, he's going to first consider what we can call traditions of particular groups. He uses an example of a medicine man in Africa and his tribe, and telling them if they kill their cattle, then something which they can't see important will happen within his tent. And with generation after generation, people are doing this, and after a while, everybody believes in it. But particular groups could be the entire American people or the Chinese civilization. Pick whatever you want. It's just not the entirety of the human race. So he says the only reason for belief ultimately in this is that everybody has believed the thing for so long that they think it must be true. And this is not good grounds for thinking that something is true. So he's going to give a rule for assessing this, and he says the rule which should guide us in these cases is simple enough. The aggregate testimony of our neighbors is subject to the same conditions as the testimony as any one of them. So heap up 50 million people believing in something. Each of those people is contributing just, their particular belief, which may be poorly founded, may be false. They might actually be lying about that. So, those three criteria that he talked about a little bit earlier in it, veracity, knowledge, judgment, they're all important. And it kind of doesn't matter that 50 million or 5 million or 50,000 believe in it. What we want to know is, well, where did these ideas come from, and were they right to believe in the first place? So we can trace it back. We can say, where did you get your ideas from? Oh, I got it from this source. Okay, where did they get their ideas from? And eventually, hopefully, we should get back to some sort of original source, what he calls the true birth and beginning of the statement. And we have to ask two serious questions in regard to him who first made it. Was he mistaken in thinking he knew about this matter? If so, then we don't have good grounds for belief in it. Or was he lying? Was he carrying out a deception of some sort? And, it's interesting. Clifford says, we don't have to go to Africa. We don't have to go to some shrine to find this sort of thing. We can actually just go. Now, he's from London. It's possible for a child to grow up in London surrounded by an atmosphere of beliefs fit only for the savage, which have in our own time been founded in fraud and propagated by credulity. So he's setting aside that kind of tradition, or traditions plural. And then he says, we've got a bigger challenge to worry about here. What about the tradition that is truly built up out of the common experience of humanity? So a tradition that covers the whole human race, not just one particular group and successive generations. So he says this great fabric is for the guidance of our thoughts, and through them our actions, both in the moral and material world. In the moral world, it gives us the conceptions of right in general, of justice, truth, beneficence, and the like. These, he says, are given to us as conceptions and not as statements or propositions. They answer to certain definitive instincts. All of us, he's going to use the example of beneficence, being good to other people. Even though, strictly speaking, you don't have to, we recognize, we should actually help other people. We should be good to them. We have an instinct that tells us it's right to be beneficent. And he says you can retire into yourself and find something wider and more lasting than your solitary personality, which says, I want to do right. I want to do good to other human beings. And we can verify that this instinct is founded upon and agrees with the other. And we should do that, he says. So that's one aspect of that tradition. He says also, though, that we have what he calls intellectual conceptions. And he says there's rules and reasons for how we ought to be, say, beneficent, or what counts as justice. He says the tradition says that at a definite place and time, such and such actions are just or true or beneficent. And to give you an example of the difference between these, he's going to say, okay, so we all know that we should be beneficent. However, what does it mean to really be beneficent? In the Middle Ages, and actually up until fairly recently, We thought that indiscriminately giving alms to beggars, that's a good thing. That's being beneficent. However, in the 19th century, we've learned more about the effects of doing that, and it tends to just produce a kind of dependency, indigency, he's going to talk about, and idleness, and preparing pauperism and misery for the future. So what do? Well, we test. We verify. And by doing this, we purify the practice and make it more beneficent. We can actually make beneficence happen better. But the very conception is made wider and wiser, he says. So he says, look, there's two important parts, the instinct of beneficence and the intellectual conception of beneficence. And we can compare the second with any proposed code of conduct and say, is this actually beneficent or not? What are our beliefs about it? And so he says that by continually asking and answering these questions, the conception grows in breadth and distinctness, and the instinct becomes strengthened and purified. So, what does this mean for tradition, the tradition of mankind? It improves along the way if we ask the right questions and have the right discussions, right? It is kept straight by means of these questions, and he says, if we don't do that, we'll gradually lose it altogether and be left with a mere code of regulations, which cannot rightly be called morality at all. So that's that, again, collection of statements as tradition, a code of morality that's not a real morality at all. He's also going to talk about beliefs and conceptions amassed, as he says, in terms of the physical world or in terms of material objects, and he says that we can, get those wrong or get those right. Sometimes those might be traditions of particular groups. He uses the example of how do you hang your hatchet, right? That's a material object. What would be the best way to do it? But he comes back to this issue about asking questions. And a material object is going to furnish him with a great example for this. So the telegraph, a fairly recent invention in his time. He's going to talk about Ohm's law, which has to do with electricity. The strength of an electric current is directly proportional to the strength of the battery which produces it, and inversely as to the length of the wire along which it has to travel, right? And that is a formulation. That's a sort of result. But you have to, think about this and figure out the question and then the solution to which it responds. And if you have somebody who's only memorized the answers, what happens if you take away the answers? They're screwed. They don't know how to get it back. What if you've shown somebody the right kind of questions to ask and how to go about answering them? They can figure it out on their own and reconstruct Ohm's law, right? He says he learns to do things, not to think he knows things, to use instruments and to ask questions, not to accept a traditional statement. And so he's going to say something really quite interesting here in regard to the sacred tradition of humanity, this tradition built up of the common experience of humanity. He says it does not consist in propositions or statements which are to be accepted and believed on the authority of the tradition. That's what a lot of people think tradition is. That's not legitimate tradition. What is tradition in its better sense? The tradition of the human race? He says it consists in, he talks about three different things. Questions rightly asked. So it's not just any questions whatsoever. It's not just the process of being, a Socratic questioner or something like that. Questions rightly asked. Having a sense for what kind of questions are pertinent, how to ask them, and then conceptions enabling us to ask further questions. Having the right kind of ideas that will allow us to ask further questions when we encounter new situations, new to us or new to humanity in general. And then methods of answering questions. So tradition doesn't just give us the answers to the questions. It helps us figure out how to frame and answer those questions for ourselves in each generation. And he's going to say the value of these things depends on their being tested day by day. The sacredness of the precious deposit imposes upon us the duty and responsibility of testing it, purifying and enlarging it to the utmost of our power. So whoever makes use of its results to stifle his own doubts, to hamper the inquiry of others, is actually guilty of a sort of sacrilege against tradition. So this is tradition in a very different sense than many people who appeal to tradition would actually make of it. But this is the point that Clifford is trying to get across. Tradition, rightly understood, is going to encompass this attitude of testing and inquiring and questioning and discussing and eventually providing answers which lead to new questions and require us to test those answers.